October 27, 1904, 2:35 in the afternoon. Mayor George McClellan sat at the controls of a silver-trimmed train car, his hand gripping a controller inscribed with his name. Behind him, 15,000 invited guests waited to experience something that most people thought was impossible. A subway. 9 miles of tunnel carved beneath the streets of Manhattan. City Hall to Harlem in 15 minutes. When McClellan pulled that lever, he did more than start a train. He launched a revolution in how cities function. He proved that American engineers could match anything London or Paris had built, and he set in motion changes that would transform not just New York, but every major city on Earth. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Just 20 years earlier, New York was drowning, not in water, in horse manure. The city had become nearly unlivable, streets choked with traffic, buildings covered in grime, the stench overwhelming, and the solution, going underground, seemed like madness to most people. This is how one of history's dirtiest problems led to one of its greatest innovations. This is how New York's subway changed the world. Chapter 1. The Horse Crisis. 1890, New York City. Picture this. You're standing on Broadway, trying to cross the street. It's mid-afternoon, and you can't move. Hundreds of horses pulling streetcars, delivery wagons, carriages, and carts pack the road from curb to curb. The noise is deafening. Iron horseshoes on cobblestone create a constant clatter that echoes between buildings. Drivers shout at each other. Horses whinny and stamp. And the smell. You can barely breathe. New York had somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 horses. Each one produced up to 30 pounds of manure every single day. Do the math. That's millions of pounds of waste ending up on city streets every 24 hours. Over 100,000 tons per year. Where did it all go? Some was collected and sold for fertilizer. But most of it didn't go anywhere. It piled up. Vacant lots around the city housed manure piles that reached 40, sometimes 60 feet high. Picture a 4-story building made entirely of horse droppings. When it rained, the streets became rivers of sludge. When it dried, the wind whipped up clouds of pulverized manure that coated buildings, got into people's lungs, and spread disease. Flies bred by the billions in the waste, carrying typhoid and other illnesses throughout the city. But here's the thing. Nobody could imagine life without horses. They were essential. Everything moved by horse. Milk deliveries in the morning, ice wagons, coal for heating, enormous brewery wagons pulled by teams of Clydesdales, delivering barrels to saloons. Department stores like Macy's maintained entire fleets of delivery horses. Even the fire department depended on specially trained horses that would rush into their harnesses at the sound of an alarm. In 1894, the Times of London published a dire prediction. If nothing changed, the paper warned, within 50 years every street in London would be buried 9 feet deep in manure. Urban planners called it the Great Manure Crisis. And it wasn't just London. New York, Paris, Berlin, every major city faced the same problem. In 1898, city officials from around the world gathered for what's considered one of the first environmental summits in history. The topic? Horse manure. Delegates came from across the globe to discuss solutions. After 3 days, they gave up. The conference, planned for 10 days, disbanded early. Nobody could figure out how to solve the problem. But there was another issue beyond the waste. Traffic. By 1900, traffic on New York streets had more than doubled in just 15 years. A horse and wagon occupied more space than a modern truck. And unlike cars that can accelerate quickly, horses moved at a steady plod. One breakdown could paralyze an entire street for hours. The New York Times published article after article complaining about the gridlock. Broadway is fast becoming impassable and unmanageable, one piece declared. Crossing the street renders it a work of great difficulty for foot passengers. The elevated trains helped somewhat. Starting in the 1870s and 80s, elevated railways had been built along 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 9th Avenues. These Ls carried passengers above the street-level chaos. By the early 1890s, the Manhattan Elevated Railway Company was carrying nearly 200 million passengers a year. But elevated trains had their own problems. They were noisy. They blocked sunlight from the streets below. They couldn't carry enough people during rush hours. And they did nothing to solve the fundamental problem of street-level congestion. New York needed something radical, something underground. But could it actually be done? Chapter 2. The Vision Takes Shape. The idea of a subway wasn't new. Back in 1869, an inventor named Alfred Ely Beach demonstrated a pneumatic subway under Broadway. It was more proof of concept than practical solution. A small tube that used air pressure to push a single car back and forth. Only 312 feet long. It operated for a few years as a curiosity, then was abandoned and forgotten. London had opened the world's first underground railway in 1863. Boston built America's first subway in 1897. But New York? New York moved slowly. Why? Money and politics. Building a subway required massive capital investment. We're talking millions of dollars, equivalent to billions today. And who would pay for it? Private companies wanted profits. The city government had limited funds. And everyone disagreed about how it should work. Should the city build it and lease operation to private companies? Should private companies build and operate it entirely? Who owned the rights to tunnel under streets? What about existing utilities? Water mains, gas pipes, sewers, electrical conduits? How do you build underneath all that infrastructure without causing chaos? These questions paralyzed the city for years. Then came the blizzard of 1888, March 12th through 14th. A catastrophic storm that buried the city under as much as 20 inches of snow. The elevated trains stopped running. Surface transportation ground to a halt. People froze to death trying to walk home. The city was essentially shut down for 3 days. That storm crystallized something in people's minds. New York needed transportation that couldn't be stopped by weather. Underground made sense. The New York State Legislature passed the Rapid Transit Act in May of 1894. It created the Board of Rapid Transit Railroad Commissioners. Their job? Figure out how to actually build this thing. The board laid out routes. They consulted with property owners. They worked through the legal tangles. By February of 1900, they were ready to move forward with Contract 1. But here's where it got interesting. They needed someone to actually build it, and they needed someone to finance it. Enter John B. McDonald, a construction contractor, solid, experienced, the kind of man who could manage a project of this scale. He won the construction contract. But McDonald needed money, a lot of it. The city would provide about half the capital needed. McDonald had to find the rest, approximately $25 million. Days before the deadline to secure financing, McDonald had nothing. Wall Street wasn't interested. Building a subway seemed too risky, too many unknowns, and returns weren't guaranteed. Then, just in time, McDonald found his backer. A man most people thought was an odd choice, a banker known more for horses and politics than street railways. August Belmont, Jr. Chapter 3. Belmont's Bet. August Belmont, Jr. was born in 1853 into American banking royalty. His father, August Belmont, Sr., had come to America in the 1830s as the Rothschild family's representative. He'd built a banking empire, collected French paintings, bred thoroughbred racehorses, and chaired the Democratic National Committee for 12 years. When he died in 1890, he left an estate worth more than $10 million. His son took over the family banking firm. Wall Street saw him as second-generation wealth. A gentleman banker who wore flowers in his buttonhole and sat on his money. The kind of man who inherits fortune rather than builds it. They underestimated him. When McDonald and his associate Andrew Friedman approached Belmont about financing the subway, most people were shocked. Belmont wasn't in-street railways. He didn't have an established presence in urban transit. Why would he risk his fortune on something so uncertain? But Belmont saw what others missed. New York's population was exploding. The city had grown from around 3 million people in 1890 to nearly 3.5 million by 1900. Those people needed to move. And whoever controlled how they moved would control enormous wealth. Belmont agreed to back McDonald with what contemporaries called unlimited money. He would finance the remaining $25 million needed to build the subway. On February 21, 1900, Contract 1 was signed between the Rapid Transit Commission and the Rapid Transit Construction Company. McDonald would build it. Belmont would fund it. They had 50 years to operate the line once it opened. In April of 1902, Belmont incorporated the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, the IRT. This would be the operating company that actually ran the trains. On March 24, 1900, ground broke at City Hall in a ceremony they called Tunnel Day. Thousands gathered to watch city officials drive ceremonial shovels into the ground. Now came the hard part: actually building the thing. Chapter 4. Building the Impossible. The challenge was staggering. New York's streets weren't empty spaces waiting to be tunneled under. They were packed with existing infrastructure. 12 miles of sewers, water mains, gas pipes, electric conduits, steam heating pipes. All of this had to be worked around, rerouted, or supported. And beneath all that, bedrock in some places, waterlogged soil in others, quicksand, underground streams. Every block presented new problems. The construction method was called cut and cover. Workers literally tore up the street. They dug down, built the tunnel below, then covered it back up. It was destructive, messy, and disruptive. Picture what this meant for daily life. Entire blocks of street torn open, sometimes for months. Wooden planks laid across the gaps so people could cross. Businesses losing customers because nobody wanted to navigate the construction zone. Noise day and night. The constant sound of jackhammers, steam shovels, blasting. In places where bedrock was too deep, they had to use different techniques. Tunnel boring machines, shield tunneling. Methods that minimized disruption but moved slower. And then there was the sheer scale. The initial line would run 9.1 miles from City Hall northward under what was then Elm Street, now Lafayette Street, and Park Avenue. At 42nd Street it would turn west, curve north again at Times Square, and continue under Broadway all the way to 145th Street in Harlem. 28 stations, most of them elaborately designed. This wasn't just going to be functional, it would be beautiful. The original City Hall station was the crown jewel. Designed by architects Hines and Lafarge, it featured vaulted tile ceilings, chandeliers, and colored glass skylights. A curved platform to match, the turn of the track. This was meant to impress people, to show them that underground transit could be elegant, even luxurious. Other stations received similar care. Tile work designed by artists, brass fixtures, good lighting. The goal was to make people comfortable with the idea of traveling underground. The project employed thousands of workers. Many were immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish, men who did backbreaking labor with picks and shovels. They faced constant danger, cave-ins, explosions from blasting, flooding. Dozens of workers died during construction. Their names are mostly forgotten now, but their work created something that would last more than a century. As construction progressed, skeptics remained. Could this actually work? Would New Yorkers really want to travel in tunnels beneath the city? Some predicted the air would be unbreathable. Others worried about fires. What if something collapsed? On October 24, 1904, newspapers announced the subway would open in 3 days. Anticipation ran high. Some people thought it was all hype. Most were simply curious. Then came opening day. Chapter 5. The Birth of Modern Transit. October 27, 1904, the day New York changed forever. The ceremony began at 2:30 in the afternoon at City Hall Station. 15,000 invited guests packed the platforms and tunnels. Officials gave speeches. They praised the engineers, the workers, the vision that made this possible. Then Mayor George McClellan took his place at the controls of the first train. The plan was simple. McClellan would start the train, operate it for a few stops, then turn the controls over to a professional motorman. But McClellan had other ideas. When someone suggested he let the motorman take over, McClellan's response was immediate. "No, sir, I'm running this train." And he did. All the way to 103rd Street. The New York Times dubbed him Mayor Motorman. The silver controller he used that day was inscribed to commemorate the moment. It would become a treasured artifact of transit history. At 7 that evening, the subway opened to the public. The fare was 5 cents. A nickel. That's about $2 in today's money. For that nickel, you could ride as far as you wanted on the system. The first person to buy a ticket remains disputed. One report said it was a middle-aged woman from Brooklyn who'd waited in line for 2 hours. Another said it was H.M. DeVoe, a deputy superintendent in the Board of Education. Both may be true. Different stations, different first customers. What isn't disputed is the overwhelming response. More than 100,000 people rode the subway on opening day. Crowds formed on every platform. Lines stretched for blocks. People weren't just commuting. They were experiencing something new. Many bought souvenir booklets. They wanted to remember this moment. The next morning, newspapers were ecstatic. "The finest subway in the world," proclaimed one headline. The Tribune announced the birth of the subway crush. Too many people trying to ride at once, and that became a problem almost immediately. The planners had anticipated heavy traffic, but they'd underestimated just how heavy. Within days, the platforms were dangerously overcrowded. Trains pulled into stations already packed to capacity. People waited through multiple trains before they could squeeze aboard. Express service made things worse in an unexpected way. When express trains arrived, everyone tried to transfer from locals. The delays at transfer stations cascaded through the system, slowing everything down. But despite the crowding, people loved it. The subway cut travel times dramatically. What had taken 45 minutes by elevated train now took 15 by subway. Workers could live farther from their jobs. Families could access parts of the city that had been too distant before. Real estate developers noticed immediately. Within weeks of the subway opening, property values began rising near stations, particularly in undeveloped areas of the Bronx and northern Manhattan. Land that had been farmland suddenly became attractive for residential development. The subway was doing exactly what its supporters had hoped. It was opening up new territories for growth. But it was also doing something else. Something that would have profound implications for decades to come. It was reshaping the city itself. Chapter 6. Expanding the Empire. The IRT's success was immediate and overwhelming. By 1905, the company extended service into the Bronx. 1908 brought expansion into Brooklyn. By 1915, trains were running into Queens. Each extension opened new areas for development and increased ridership. But August Belmont wasn't content with just operating the original line. He wanted control of New York's entire transit system. In 1903, the IRT leased Manhattan's elevated railways. Now, Belmont controlled both the new subway and the old elevated lines. He had a monopoly on rapid transit in Manhattan. Critics accused him of deliberately keeping the trains crowded to maximize profits, and they weren't entirely wrong. Belmont himself wrote, "If a day ever comes when transportation during rush hours is done without crowding, the companies doing it will fail financially." Crowded trains meant high revenue per car. Adding more service meant more expenses. Belmont balanced profitability against public demand, and profitability usually won. This created pressure for competition. If one company couldn't or wouldn't provide adequate service, maybe others should get a chance. In 1913, the city made a bold move: the dual contracts. These agreements brought in a competitor, the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, which became the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation, or BMT. The contracts required both the IRT and BMT to build massive expansions, new lines, new stations. The goal was to more than double the size of the system. The city provided funding, the companies provided operation. In return, both companies agreed to maintain a 5-cent fare indefinitely. That fare restriction would prove catastrophic. As costs rose over the following decades, inflation, labor expenses, maintenance, the 5-cent fare became unsustainable. But the companies couldn't raise it. They were locked in by contract. The BMT went bankrupt. The IRT struggled financially despite huge ridership. Both systems limped along, unable to properly maintain infrastructure or expand service adequately. Meanwhile, the city decided to build its own system. In 1932, the Independent Subway System, the IND, opened its first lines. The city both owned and operated these routes. The IND was meant to compete directly with the private companies and eventually replace them. For years, New York had 3 separate subway systems: the IRT, the BMT, the IND. Each with its own routes, its own train cars, its own stations. Some stations connected, but the systems didn't integrate smoothly. This lasted until 1940. That year, the city purchased both the IRT and BMT, bringing all 3 systems under unified public control. The Board of Transportation would operate them as one network. But by then, the financial damage was done. Decades of deferred maintenance had taken their toll. The cars were old, the tracks worn, the stations deteriorating, and yet ridership kept climbing. During World War II, the system recorded its highest ridership ever. On December 23, 1946, the subway carried 8,872,249 passengers in a single day. That record still stands. How did New York's subway influence the world? Chapter 7. Changing Cities Forever. The New York City subway didn't just change New York. It became a model that cities around the world studied and, in many cases, copied. Before the subway, cities had natural size limits. People could only travel so far by foot or horse-drawn vehicle. This meant cities stayed relatively compact, with populations concentrated near harbors, rail stations, or other transport hubs. The subway shattered those limits. Suddenly, people could live 10, 15, even 20 miles from their workplace and still commute in reasonable time. This enabled cities to spread horizontally in ways that had never been possible before. Look at what happened in New York. When the subway reached the Bronx, rural farmland transformed into residential neighborhoods within a few years. Property developers followed the subway lines, building apartment buildings and houses wherever stations opened. The same pattern repeated in Brooklyn, Queens, and every other area the subway touched. Urban planners even coined a term for it: transit-oriented development. Build the transit first, and development will follow. This wasn't unique to New York. Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, every American city with a subway system saw similar patterns. But the international impact was even more significant. Tokyo began planning its subway in the 1920s, studying New York's system carefully. When Tokyo's first line opened in 1927, it drew directly on lessons learned from the IRT. Today, Tokyo's subway carries more than 8 million passengers daily, making it one of the busiest in the world. Paris expanded its metro system throughout the 20th century. London continuously extended the tube. Moscow built an elaborate underground network starting in the 1930s. Each system had unique features, but all owed a debt to the pioneering work done in New York. After World War II, dozens more cities built subways, some in Western Europe and North America. More recently, massive systems in Asia, Seoul, Shanghai, Beijing, Delhi, and others. By the 21st century, hundreds of cities worldwide operate underground rapid transit. New York demonstrated 3 crucial lessons. First, underground transit works. It's practical, efficient, and can handle enormous passenger volumes. The early fears about air quality, safety, public acceptance proved unfounded. Second, transit drives real estate development. Property near stations becomes more valuable. This creates opportunities for dense, walkable neighborhoods that reduce dependence on cars. Third, cities need constant investment in transit. New York learned this the hard way during the 1970s and 80s, when decades of deferred maintenance led to a system crisis. But the lesson applies everywhere. Transit infrastructure requires ongoing funding to remain effective. Beyond the practical impacts, the subway changed something more fundamental. It changed how people thought about cities. Before the subway, most people lived close to where they worked. Neighborhoods were insular. People rarely ventured far from their immediate area. The subway made the entire city accessible. A garment worker living in the Bronx could work in the garment district in Manhattan. A clerk living in Brooklyn could commute to downtown. People from different neighborhoods, different backgrounds, different cultures mixed on subway platforms and in train cars. This had profound social implications. The subway became a great leveler. Rich and poor rode the same trains. Recent immigrants sat next to established families. In those crowded cars, everyone was just another passenger trying to get somewhere. That democratic mixing helped create a distinctly New York culture, one that valued diversity, mobility, and constant interaction with strangers. The subway didn't cause this culture by itself, but it enabled and reinforced it. Chapter 8. The Dark Years and Revival. By the 1970s, the New York City subway had become a symbol of urban decay. Ridership had plummeted from the post-war highs. Many middle-class families had moved to the suburbs. Those who remained often drove rather than take the subway. Crime was rampant. Graffiti covered every surface of trains and stations. Cars broke down constantly. Delays were expected, not exceptions. The system was quite literally falling apart. Decades of deferred maintenance came due all at once. Signal systems dating to the 1920s needed replacement. Track had worn through in places. Stations were crumbling. And the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which took control of the system in 1968, didn't have the funds to fix everything. By 1982, ridership had fallen to levels not seen since 1917. Around 300 million fewer passengers rode annually compared to a decade earlier. The main reason? Fear. In 1984, an incident crystallized public anxiety. A man named Bernhard Goetz shot 4 young men on a subway train after they asked him for money. He claimed self-defense. The case became a national sensation, sparking debates about crime, race, and urban safety. The press dubbed him the subway vigilante. To some, he represented frustrated New Yorkers fighting back against rampant crime. To others, he symbolized dangerous vigilantism and racial tension. Whatever people's views, the incident underscored an undeniable fact. The subway felt unsafe. The MTA chairman at the time, Richard Ravitch, admitted he was scared to ride the subway. When the person running the system won't use it, you know there's a problem. But starting in the late 1980s, things began to change. The city implemented new policing strategies. The transit police focused on minor offenses like fare evasion and vandalism. The theory was that cracking down on small crimes would help prevent larger ones. It worked. Crime rates began falling. Graffiti became a particular focus. The MTA launched an aggressive anti-graffiti campaign. Clean trains stayed clean. Vandalized trains were taken out of service immediately and cleaned. Within a few years, graffiti essentially disappeared from the system. Massive capital investment began repairing decades of neglect. New signal systems, track replacement, station renovations, modern train cars. It took billions of dollars and years of work, but slowly the system improved. By the 1990s, ridership was climbing again. By 2000, it exceeded 5 million riders on an average weekday. Today, it's back around 5 to 6 million daily, making it one of the busiest subway systems in the world. But the revival wasn't just about infrastructure. It represented something larger. New York's decision to invest in the subway was, in effect, a decision to invest in the city itself. Other cities made different choices. Many American cities abandoned their streetcar and rail systems in favor of highways and cars. Los Angeles tore up an extensive streetcar network. So did many others. New York kept its subway. Even during the worst years, even when it seemed like a money pit with no return, the city maintained it. That commitment has paid enormous dividends. Today, New York's high density, walkability, and relatively low car ownership are directly attributable to the subway. The system carries more passengers annually than all the commuter rail systems in North America combined. It's an essential part of what makes New York work. Chapter 9. The legacy lives on. Stand on a subway platform today, and you're standing on history. Parts of the system date to 1904. The original City Hall station, though closed to regular service in 1945, still exists. The New York Transit Museum runs occasional tours through it. The curved platform, the elegant tile work, the brass fixtures, they're all still there, preserved as a reminder of where this began. Many of the stations built in the early 20th century remain in daily use. Walk through the Times Square complex or Grand Central, and you're using infrastructure that's over 100 years old. Modified, yes. Renovated, certainly. But fundamentally the same tunnels and platforms that early riders used. This longevity is remarkable. Most transportation infrastructure becomes obsolete within decades. Roads need constant resurfacing. Bridges require replacement. But properly maintained subway tunnels can last indefinitely. The system has nearly 500 stations today, more than 800 track miles, 25 routes. It operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, one of the few subway systems in the world that never closes. That 24-hour service is significant. It means the city never sleeps, not just metaphorically. Night shift workers can commute. Late-night entertainment venues stay viable. Emergency transport is always available. It's a defining characteristic of New York life. But the subway faces ongoing challenges. The infrastructure is aging. Much of it needs replacement or major renovation. The Second Avenue subway, a project first proposed in the 1920s, only opened its first phase in 2017. That's nearly a century from conception to partial completion. Other expansion projects move similarly slowly. Funding remains a perpetual issue. The MTA relies on a complex mix of fares, taxes, tolls, and subsidies. Political fights over funding never end. Every governor and mayor faces difficult choices about how much to invest in transit versus other priorities. And yet, despite these challenges, the subway remains indispensable. During the COVID-19 pandemic, ridership plummeted. At its lowest point in April 2020, the subway carried about 400,000 riders daily, a 90% drop from normal levels. People worried the subway might never recover, but it has. By 2024, weekday ridership was back above 4 million. The recovery continues. Because fundamentally, New York needs its subway. Dense urban living doesn't work without efficient mass transit. The lessons from New York's experience apply globally. Cities that build comprehensive transit systems thrive. They can accommodate population growth without sprawling into suburbs. They reduce traffic congestion and air pollution. They create more livable, walkable neighborhoods. Cities that don't build transit face ongoing challenges. Traffic congestion, long commute times, environmental degradation, car-dependent sprawl. Look at the difference between cities with strong transit and those without. Tokyo, London, Paris, New York, these cities function despite having populations in the millions or tens of millions. Why? Efficient transit systems move people quickly and affordably. Compare that to cities like Los Angeles or Houston, which developed primarily around cars. They struggle with traffic, air quality, and infrastructure costs that transit-oriented cities avoid. That's not to say subways solve every problem. They're expensive to build and maintain. They require dense populations to justify the investment. Not every city needs or can support a subway system, but for major urban centers, the New York subway proved something crucial. You can build big, you can move millions of people efficiently, and you can do it underground, preserving the streets above for other uses. That proof of concept changed urban planning forever. August Belmont Jr. died in 1924, 20 years after the subway opened. He'd made his fortune. He'd built one of the great infrastructure projects in American history. He'd proven the skeptics wrong, but he couldn't have imagined what his subway would become. Today, over 120 years after that first train departed City Hall, the system Belmont financed carries approximately 1.7 billion passengers annually. Think about that number. 1.7 billion trips. That's more people than live in Europe or North America combined, using one transit system in a single year. Every morning, millions of New Yorkers descend underground. Office workers heading to Manhattan, students commuting to colleges, healthcare workers traveling to hospitals, construction workers, teachers, artists, entrepreneurs. All depend on trains running through tunnels carved more than a century ago. The subway enabled New York to become what it is. Without it, the city couldn't function at its current size and density. The skyscrapers, the theater district, the financial centers, all require the ability to move millions of people in and out daily. The subway makes that possible. But beyond New York, the subway's influence extends worldwide. When urban planners in Beijing or Mumbai or Mexico City design transit systems, they study New York. When engineers tackle complex underground construction, They reference techniques pioneered by the IRT. When cities debate how to manage growth, they look at how transit shaped New York's development. The Great Manure Crisis of 1894 seems quaint now. We forget that cities once faced an unsolvable environmental disaster. Horse-drawn transportation had reached its absolute limit. Something had to change. The subway was that change. It replaced thousands of horses with electric trains. It cleared the streets. It enabled cities to grow beyond their previous limitations. Other technologies helped too: cars, buses, eventually other forms of transit. But the subway proved the concept. It showed that underground rapid transit could work at massive scale. Standing on a platform today, waiting for a train, few people think about this history. The subway is just there, part of the urban landscape, as unremarkable as the streets above or the buildings around them. But it's worth remembering, worth appreciating. Every time you ride the subway, you're using infrastructure that required vision, courage, and massive investment to create. You're benefiting from decisions made by people who are long gone, but whose work continues serving millions. The New York City subway didn't just change how New Yorkers travel. It changed how cities everywhere function. It proved that dense urban living can work. It demonstrated that public infrastructure investment pays long-term dividends. It showed that seemingly impossible engineering challenges can be overcome. That October day in 1904, when Mayor McClellan pulled that silver controller, he set in motion changes that would ripple across the globe for more than a century. He started more than a train. He started a revolution. And that revolution is still running. Every single day.